Hi everyone. Thanks for joining us today. We've got a brand new story to share with you. So let's begin. My name is Zachary, and if you had asked me a year ago, I would have told you I was happily married. I genuinely believed she was the kind of person I thought I'd grow old with. I trusted her with everything in me, not just because we'd been together for a long time, but because she never gave me a reason not to. We were married for 6 years, and before that, we dated for 3. That's almost a decade of my life wrapped up in one person. I thought we were in this for the long haul. So imagine what it feels like to wake up one day and realize that the person you loved most went out of town for a wedding, and somewhere between the vows and the dance floor, she gave herself to another man and came back to infect me with an STD. It broke me, and I couldn't wrap my head around it. And in that moment, I knew this marriage wasn't worth saving. When I met Ruth, the woman who would eventually become my wife, she captured my heart. She was thoughtful, attentive, and present. When you find someone who brings peace into your life, you don't question it. You hold on to it. We dated for 3 years before we got married. And during those 3 years, I never once felt like I had to question her loyalty. She was more than just my girlfriend. She was my best friend. We'd talk about everything. She'd always say she wanted a big family, 3, maybe 4 kids. I wanted that too. So when we finally got married, I honestly believed we were building something unshakable. 6 years into that marriage, I still loved her just as deeply because love grows when you go through things together. And we did go through things. The biggest one was the struggle to have kids. After we got married, we started trying almost right away. But Ruth had 2 miscarriages, one after the other. The doctors eventually advised us to take a break, to give her body some time to recover. Emotionally, it was a difficult time for both of us. We were grieving something that never got a chance to be. But I told her, we'll be okay. We'll get through this together. And I believe that. From the outside, everything looked normal. Nobody gets into a marriage thinking the person they trust most in the world is going to betray them. I sure didn't. Ruth was the last person I ever expected to lie to me, let alone cheat. But life has a way of throwing you into situations you didn't sign up for. And sometimes the people you think you know best turn out to be hiding a side of themselves you never imagined existed. One evening, Ruth got an invitation to a close friend's wedding. It was a destination wedding that everyone flew out to and turned into a weekend getaway. When Ruth brought the invitation to me, she was excited, talking about how it would be nice to be around friends again, how it'd be good to take a break. I looked at the cost of flights, hotels, and the travel back, and honestly, it didn't seem wise for both of us to go at that time. Things were tight on my end. I was dealing with some deadlines at work that I couldn't afford to miss. So I told her to go without me. I thought it would be a sweet gesture. It's your friend's big day, I told her. Go. Enjoy yourself. Before she left, I drove her to the airport myself. I wanted to see her off properly. We got there early enough, and I stayed with her through check-in, waited while she got her boarding pass. I remember waving at her as she turned that corner, smiling. I had no reason, none whatsoever, to feel uneasy. The week she was gone, my job kept me busy, and I used that as a way to fill the silence in the house. The day she flew back, I was there waiting at arrivals. She came out looking like herself. On the drive home, she talked about how beautiful the wedding was. I nodded along, adding in my comments here and there, happy that she'd had a good time. She seemed happy. That evening, we had dinner together, sat across from each other, and talked like we usually did. Then we curled up on the couch and caught up on a show or 2. Later that night, we got intimate, and she fell asleep in my arms, just like she always had. I didn't feel a single shift in our rhythm. Suppose you'd asked me, after she returned, whether I trusted her. I would have told you yes, without blinking. I had no idea what that wedding had really meant, or what it had set in motion. It was about 3 weeks after Ruth got back from the wedding trip that I started feeling unwell. I couldn't really explain it at first. I figured maybe I had pushed myself too hard at work or wasn't drinking enough water. But as the days went by, the symptoms didn't go away. In fact, they got worse. It reached a point where I knew this wasn't something I could ignore anymore. So I booked a doctor's appointment. At the clinic, I explained everything I was feeling, down to the last awkward detail. I've never been the kind of guy who likes hospitals, but I needed answers. They ran some tests, and hours later, when the doctor came back with the results, he said I tested positive for an STD. I actually laughed at first. I told him that it couldn't be right, that there had to be some sort of mistake with the test. I told him, "Doc, I've only ever been with my wife. I don't mess around. You've got the wrong guy." But he just looked at me and said something I'll never forget. "Sometimes people aren't as honest as we believe." That sentence hit me. I sat there, stunned, hearing the words but not really processing them. Even with that result in my hand, my mind was racing with excuses, trying to protect the version of her I had built up over the years. So I told myself, maybe this clinic messed up the test. I went to a second clinic. Different part of town. Different lab. I went through the whole process again. Waited a couple of days. And when those results came in, it was the same outcome. Positive. That second test made it obvious that I couldn't deny it anymore. And this wasn't a mistake. But even then, I couldn't bring myself to just barge into the living room and accuse Ruth. What if I was wrong about how I got it? What if there was some kind of mix-up still? I didn't want to throw out a marriage over suspicion and regret it later. So instead of confrontation, I made a choice. I would investigate quietly. I started paying closer attention. I waited for the moment when she'd leave her phone unattended. When I finally got my hands on it, I checked everything: texts, call logs, photos, and social media. But there was nothing there. Either she'd cleaned up really well, or she hadn't used her phone for whatever happened. It only added to my frustration. I started questioning myself again. What if I really got it from somewhere else? What if the doctor was wrong twice? I didn't want to believe it was her. But then, one evening, I was cleaning up our bedroom while she was in the kitchen making dinner. I went to grab something from her bag, and that's when I saw a small, almost empty prescription bottle. It had her name on it. I didn't even recognize the medication, so I did what anyone would do. I searched it online right there on my phone. My heart sank. It was antibiotics, the kind prescribed for treating an STD. That was the confirmation I didn't want but couldn't ignore anymore. I stood there, holding the bottle. Then I called my wife, Ruth. "Can you come here for a second?" She came in, wiping her hands on a kitchen towel, completely unaware. I held up the bottle and asked, "How did you get an STD?" That was the question that broke the mask. First, she tried to act confused. "What are you talking about?" Then she looked at the bottle and said, "Oh, that's not for me. It's for my friend. She asked me to pick it up for her." I couldn't help it. I laughed because it was insulting. That was her excuse? I told her point blank, "We're going for a test. Both of us." She immediately tensed up. "You can't force me to do that," she snapped. And that's when I laid it out. "I don't have to force you. I already got tested. Twice. And I came back positive." Her face went pale. She didn't try to lie anymore. She started crying. "Please." "I'm sorry," she kept saying. "I didn't mean for this to happen." I stood there, watching the woman I had once adored beg for forgiveness. And even then, part of me hoped she'd say something that would make it less awful. That it was some kind of misunderstanding. But no. She admitted that it happened at the wedding. Said it was a guy she used to be close with in college. That they'd had too much to drink, and one thing led to another. She thought telling the truth would make it easier to forgive. But all I could think about was how I kissed her when she came back. How I held her. How we made love that night. And all the while, she knew and carried on like nothing had happened. And in that moment, whatever love I still had for her was now tangled up in disgust, betrayal, and a sense of humiliation I can't describe. I just walked out. Ruth was still standing there in the bedroom, her face wet with tears, calling out my name as I made my way down the hall. But I didn't look back. I needed air and space. It felt like my chest was caving in, like something heavy was pressing down on me from the inside. I had trusted this woman with everything in me. And now, I had an STD to show for it. When I came back home later that evening, I took my pillow, a blanket, and moved straight into the guest room. My mind was a mess. Ruth tried to act normal. She made dinner, like always. She knocked on the door softly and told me it was ready. I didn't answer or come out to eat. And every time she saw me moving around the house after that day, she'd try to talk to me, say she was sorry, say she didn't mean for it to happen, that she was drunk, that she made a stupid mistake. She kept using that word, mistake. But every time she said it, I felt something in me harden even more. The truth is, her confession didn't come out of guilt. It came out of fear. Because she didn't confess until I showed her the bottle of medication. She didn't come clean until she had no other choice. If I hadn't found that bottle, if I hadn't tested positive, would she have ever told me at all? That's what kept me up at night. That's what made it impossible to believe anything else she said. I started to look at everything differently. Was this really the first time? Or just the first time she got caught? I didn't know anymore. That week in the guest room, I barely slept. After 7 days of silence and wrestling with my thoughts, I made my decision. I didn't give her a chance to talk me out of it. I just went ahead and filed for divorce. Quietly. I didn't tell her because I didn't owe her another opportunity to explain why she betrayed me. And since we didn't have any children, there was nothing binding us anymore. No reason to stay and pretend this could ever be repaired. She had already made her choice. Now I was making mine. When Ruth got served the divorce papers, she didn't take it quietly. I remember coming home from work that evening, and there she was, standing by the doorway with red eyes. The papers must have been dropped off earlier in the day, and she'd clearly already gone through them. She broke down the moment I stepped in and said, "Please, Zachary, please don't do this. It was a mistake. I didn't mean for any of this to happen." I told her calmly that this wasn't just a mistake. What she did was a choice. And worst of all, the fact that she only admitted to it after I found the medication and told her I was already infected. That wasn't a moment of weakness. That was a pattern of betrayal wrapped in cowardice. I told her point blank, "I can't trust you anymore. You lied and waited for me to discover it on my own. That's not love. That's manipulation." I also told her she couldn't stay in the house anymore. The house was a gift from my mother, and the title was still under her name. I made that clear to her. "You're going to have to move out, Ruth. After everything you've done, you don't get to stay and act like none of it happened." She didn't take that well. Her tears turned to frustration. I don't know if she thought I'd change my mind or if someone in her corner filled her head with false hope, but instead of leaving quietly, she escalated the whole thing to court. My lawyer laid everything bare. He presented the facts, the medical records, the timeline, and the argument was simple. This woman not only broke her marital vows, she endangered my health and then tried to cover it up. That's more than grounds for divorce. That's grounds for removal. Ruth, of course, tried to spin it differently. But the court wasn't interested in emotional appeals without facts. The judge looked at the documents, heard both sides, and gave the ruling. She had to vacate the property. A firm date was given. This was never about punishing her. It was about protecting myself from a life that was built on a lie. We were close to finalizing the divorce. The legal back and forth had been long, tiring, and honestly, I was counting the days until I could close that chapter of my life and move forward in peace. But out of nowhere, Ruth and her lawyer came back to court with a fresh claim, one that changed the entire direction of things. Ruth stood there in front of the judge and said she was 16 weeks pregnant, and that the baby was mine. I remember sitting there trying to keep a straight face, but inside, my stomach dropped. I didn't know whether to laugh, panic, or walk straight out of the courtroom. Because here's the thing, was it possible the baby was mine? Sure. We were still sleeping together before I found out about the affair. But that doubt, that little gap in trust that her betrayal had created, it made me question everything. I had already tested positive for an STD she gave me. She had already admitted to cheating. And now, after being caught, after I filed for divorce, she shows up talking about a baby? The timing was suspicious, and my instincts told me not to take her word at face value. I wasn't even sure she was telling the truth about being pregnant at first. But she had medical confirmation, and so the court took it seriously. The judge decided that paternity had to be established before the divorce could be finalized. That meant everything, every document, every agreement, every ounce of closure I was building toward had to be paused, put on hold, just like that, until the baby was born and the truth came out. Those months of waiting were brutal, not just because of the legal delay, but because of the thoughts racing through my head every single day. What if it were mine? What would that mean? Would she use the child to stay tied to me? Would she suddenly act like the past didn't matter and try to rebuild something I had already buried? I didn't trust her intentions, not anymore. And I definitely didn't trust that this pregnancy was just about the baby. It felt like one more move on her part, a last-ditch attempt to hold onto the life she was losing. When the child was finally born, I didn't waste a second. I made sure the paternity test was done immediately. And when the results came back, proving the baby wasn't mine, I don't even have words to describe the relief that washed over me. I felt like I could finally exhale after holding my breath for months. It confirmed everything I had feared. If I hadn't discovered her cheating when I did, I could have ended up raising another man's child, completely in the dark. That kind of betrayal isn't just cruel, it's life-altering. And knowing I dodged that bullet only made me more grateful that I walked away when I did. That moment, when I saw the results in black and white, was the final seal on my decision. I didn't need more evidence. I didn't need another argument or explanation from her. That baby, that lie, that manipulation all showed me the kind of person she had become. And I knew, without a doubt, I made the right choice. After everything, I still had one thing left nagging at me. I needed to know who the man was. I needed to know exactly who Ruth threw our marriage away for. She had only mentioned that it was some guy she used to be close to in college, but that was too vague for me to sit with. So, I started digging. Quietly. I went through old yearbooks, her Facebook comments, tag photos, and even checked who she followed on Instagram. It didn't happen overnight, but eventually, things started to click. Turns out, the guy she hooked up with at the wedding wasn't just someone from college. He was a married man. Not only did Ruth betray me, but she did it with someone who had also made vows to someone else. At that point, I felt disgust. This wasn't just about me anymore. There was another innocent person out there, living her life, completely unaware that her husband had gotten another woman pregnant. I wrestled with whether or not to say anything. I mean, it wasn't really my business, but then again, if it were me, I'd want to know. So I took the respectful route. I found the man's wife on Facebook after making sure it was really her, and sent her a message. I just told her the truth. I explained that her husband had been involved with my now ex-wife during a wedding trip. I included a couple of references from our court documents, enough to prove that what I was saying wasn't made up. I told her there was a pregnancy involved, that the paternity was initially pinned on me, but tests confirmed the child wasn't mine. I ended the message by saying, "What you choose to do with this information is completely up to you. I just thought you had the right to know." And that was it. I didn't follow up. I didn't lurk on her profile, waiting for a response. I didn't go back to check if their marriage blew up or if she confronted him. I didn't need that closure. When the divorce was finally finalized and the last page was signed, it was like this heavy coat I didn't realize I'd been wearing for months was finally taken off my shoulders. The biggest relief of all was knowing that the child wasn't mine. Because if it had been, no matter how much I wanted to move on, I would have been tethered to Ruth forever. She would have always had a reason to be in my life. But instead, I got to walk away clean, with no lingering chains tying me to a woman I could never trust again. I've learned now that peace doesn't come from trying to fix broken people. It comes from protecting your own spirit. Hi everyone, welcome back. We've got a brand new story to share with you. So let's begin. My name is Stephen. The lawsuit papers arrived by certified mail on a Tuesday afternoon. I was finishing up work when I noticed the certified mail slip from the Postal Service. When I picked up the package the next day, I immediately saw the official court documents with my name listed as the defendant in a civil lawsuit. As I read through the papers, my initial reaction was confusion, then a sinking feeling in my stomach. The lawsuit was filed by my wife, Helen, seeking significant damages. But Helen wasn't suing anyone. Helen couldn't sue anyone. Helen had been dead for over a year. I immediately called the law office listed on the lawsuit papers. When I reached the attorney, I explained that there had to be some mistake. Helen wasn't suing anyone because Helen had died last year from complications during what was supposed to be a routine surgery. There was no lawsuit from her because there couldn't be. She was buried in Riverside Cemetery over 13 months ago. The silence on the other end of the line stretched for what felt like an eternity. When the lawyer finally spoke again, his professional composure had cracked slightly. He asked me to repeat what I had just said, clearly confused about how he had filed a lawsuit on behalf of a deceased person. What followed was the beginning of one of the most surreal and infuriating legal battles of my life. A battle that would reveal just how accurate Helen had been about her family and how far some people will go when they see dollar signs. Helen died on March 14, 2023, 2 days after what should have been a simple surgery. The surgery itself had gone according to plan, but Helen had an unexpected allergic reaction to one of the post-operative medications. Within hours, she was in anaphylactic shock. Despite the medical team's best efforts, her body couldn't recover from the cascade of complications that followed. We had been married for 8 years at that point. Helen was 34 when she died. We owned our home together, had joint bank accounts, shared everything the way married couples do. She had a small investment stake in one of the leading agrochemical companies in the country, a modest retirement account from her previous job, and that was about it. We weren't wealthy by any stretch, but we were comfortable. Helen had always been distant from her family. Her unmarried sister, Susan, and brother Caleb lived about 2 hours away, and in all the years I knew Helen, I could count on one hand the number of times they had visited or even called just to check in. But they had no problem reaching out whenever they needed something. Helen used to refer to them as leeches, always taking but never giving anything back. The funeral was small. Her siblings showed up, but they seemed more interested in asking about Helen's affairs than actually mourning her. They made some vague comments about her belongings and asked whether she had left any specific instructions about her things. I was too deep in grief to think much of it at the time, and honestly, I assumed they were just trying to process their own loss in their own way. After Helen's death, I went through the standard legal procedures. Since we were married and Helen died without a will, everything passed to me automatically under our state's intestacy laws. The house we had bought together remained in my name, our joint bank accounts became solely mine, and I was the named beneficiary on her retirement account. I worked with a probate attorney to ensure everything was handled correctly, and within a few months, I thought all the legal matters were settled. That's why the lawsuit mail hit me like a freight train. After receiving the lawsuit papers and calling the confused lawyer, I immediately contacted the attorney who had helped me with Helen's estate. He had been recommended by a friend years earlier, and he had handled the probate process with professionalism and genuine sympathy for my situation. When I called my attorney's office in that initial phone call, his secretary, recognizing the urgency in my voice, managed to squeeze me in for a meeting 2 days later. When I walked into his downtown office 2 days later, I was still reeling from the absurdity of the situation. My attorney listened carefully as I explained the lawsuit and the alleged $10 million lawsuit. He pulled up his files from Helen's estate and reviewed the documentation we had filed over a year earlier. After about 30 minutes of reviewing papers and asking questions, he leaned back in his chair and gave me his assessment. In his opinion, this sounded like what lawyers call a fishing expedition, a lawsuit filed without solid legal grounds in hopes of pressuring the defendant into a settlement. He explained that under our state's laws, when someone dies without a will, their surviving spouse inherits everything before any extended family members. Since Helen and I were legally married and all our major assets were jointly owned, her family had no automatic claim to anything. My attorney's strategy was straightforward. We would gather all the documentation proving our marriage, the joint ownership of our assets, and Helen's cause of death. Then we would respond to the lawsuit by demonstrating that the plaintiffs had no legal standing to make their claims. But first, my lawyer wanted to find out who was actually behind this lawsuit, because it certainly wasn't Helen. His investigation didn't take long to uncover the truth. The lawsuit hadn't been filed by Helen, obviously, but by her family. Helen's sister was listed as the primary plaintiff, with her brother as a supporting plaintiff. The lawsuit's claims were as audacious as they were legally questionable. According to the filed documents, Susan and Caleb alleged that I had unfairly taken assets that should have been part of Helen's estate and distributed among her blood relatives. The lawsuit sought damages of several $1,000,000 based on their claims about Helen's separate property and business interests. The more I read through their claims, the more obvious it became that Susan and Caleb fundamentally misunderstood how inheritance law works. They seemed to believe that Helen's death automatically entitled them to a share of her estate, regardless of the fact that she was married and we owned everything jointly. Either they had been given terrible legal advice, or they were hoping that the threat of a lengthy court battle would pressure me into settling for some amount of money just to make the problem go away. They claimed that Helen had owned property independently before our marriage that should have passed to them upon her death. The reality was that Helen had owned a small condo before we got married, but we had sold it and used the proceeds as part of the down payment for the house we bought together. All the documentation of this transaction was in our real estate records. They alleged that certain business investments were solely in Helen's name and, therefore, should be considered separate property. This was referring to Helen's small stake in the agrochemical company, but that investment had been made with money from our joint savings account during our marriage. I had the bank records to prove it. Perhaps most offensively, they claimed that I had manipulated Helen into changing her will to exclude her family. The problem with this allegation was that Helen had never had a formal will in the first place. She had died intestate, which is exactly why the standard inheritance laws applied. Laws that give everything to the surviving spouse when there are no children involved. They also claimed that various bank accounts and retirement funds should be split among family members rather than going entirely to me. Again, this showed a fundamental misunderstanding of how beneficiary designations and joint accounts work. Helen had either listed me as the beneficiary on her retirement accounts, or we held the accounts jointly. There was documentation for all of this. My lawyer suspected that Susan and Caleb had consulted with a lawyer or someone who had either given them completely incorrect information about their rights or had encouraged them to file a nuisance lawsuit, hoping to pressure me into settling for some amount rather than fighting a prolonged legal battle. The first court date was scheduled 2 months from the day I got the lawsuit. My lawyer had appeared before the judge who was assigned to the case on several occasions. My lawyer's strategy for the initial hearing was simple. Present clear, undeniable documentation of my marriage to Helen, proof of joint ownership of our assets, and evidence that Helen had died without a will, making the inheritance laws straightforward to apply. On the first hearing, Susan and Caleb's attorney presented their case first. His presentation was surprisingly vague, focusing more on general principles about family inheritance rights than on specific evidence supporting their claims. He spoke about the importance of blood relatives having access to a deceased person's estate and suggested that I had acted too quickly to transfer assets after Helen's death. When my lawyer presented our counterargument, the difference in preparation was immediately obvious. He had brought Helen's death certificate, our marriage certificate, property deeds showing joint ownership, bank records demonstrating joint accounts, and beneficiary designation forms from Helen's retirement accounts. Everything was organized, documented, and legally sound. The judge allowed the case to proceed to the discovery phase, but her questions to my Susan's lawyer suggested she was already skeptical of the plaintiff's claims. She asked specifically what evidence they had to support their allegations about separate property and whether they understood the legal implications of Helen dying intestate while married. Walking out of that courtroom, I felt frustrated that I was having to defend my legal right to inherit from my own wife. The emotional toll of reliving Helen's death while simultaneously fighting her family in court was exhausting. But my lawyer was confident that once we got through the discovery process, the case would collapse under the weight of the evidence. The discovery phase ran for months, And it was during this period that the case took a much more serious turn. My lawyer approached the discovery process with characteristic thoroughness, requesting all documents that Susan and Caleb's side claimed supported their allegations. The first red flag appeared early, when we received copies of documents that Susan's legal team claimed proved Helen's separate ownership of certain assets. My lawyer immediately noticed that several of these documents didn't match the official records held by the county recorder's office. A property deed allegedly showing Helen's individual ownership of an investment property had details that didn't align with the actual recorded deed. My lawyer consulted with a forensic document examiner he had worked with on previous cases involving questionable paperwork. The examiner specialized in detecting document forgery and alteration, particularly in cases involving digital manipulation of official records. His analysis was damning. The property deed provided by Susan's team showed clear evidence of digital alteration. Someone had taken a legitimate document and modified key details, including ownership percentages and dates. Bank statements that purportedly showed Helen maintaining separate accounts had similar signs of manipulation, and the signatures on several documents didn't match authenticated samples of Helen's actual signature. During the discovery process, my lawyer learned that Susan and Caleb had been contacting Helen's former business associates, falsely representing themselves as Helen's legal heirs. They had attempted to redirect a small quarterly payment from Helen's investment and had tried to claim a modest life insurance benefit through Helen's former employer that listed me as the sole beneficiary. My lawyer realized we were no longer dealing with a simple civil dispute over inheritance rights. Susan and Caleb had crossed the line into criminal fraud territory by forging documents and making false representations to third parties in an attempt to steal assets that legally belonged to me. My lawyer made the decision to contact the district attorney's office. A detective who specializes in financial crimes and fraud cases was assigned to investigate the potential criminal violations. The detective reviewed the evidence of document forgery, false representations to businesses, and attempted theft by deception. Once the criminal implications became clear, Susan and Caleb's attorney withdrew from representing them due to the ethical complications. Susan and Caleb were forced to find new representation and hired a criminal defense attorney who had the unenviable task of defending clients who appeared to have committed multiple felonies. My lawyer's strategy shifted dramatically. Instead of simply defending against a civil lawsuit, we were now actively pursuing criminal charges against Susan and Caleb. He advised me that we should pursue this case to its full conclusion, both to ensure justice for Helen's memory and to prevent Susan and Caleb from attempting similar schemes in the future. The more I learned about what Susan and Caleb had been doing behind the scenes, the more I realized that Helen had been absolutely right about her family. They truly were leeches, and they had been planning this scheme probably since the day Helen died. The final court hearing took place on December 8, 2024. The judge had reviewed all the evidence collected during discovery, including the forensic analysis of the forged documents and the detective's investigation into the criminal fraud allegations. My lawyer's presentation was comprehensive and devastating. He walked through the clear chain of titles showing joint ownership of all major assets, presented our marriage certificate and Helen's death certificate, and methodically dismantled every claim Susan and Caleb had made. The evidence of document forgery was particularly compelling. Their old lawyer had withdrawn from a case earlier, and the new lawyer, the public defender, was left trying to defend the indefensible. His strategy seemed to focus on characterizing the forged documents as misunderstandings rather than intentional fraud, but the evidence was too overwhelming to support that interpretation. The judge's ruling was swift and unambiguous. She dismissed the lawsuit with prejudice, meaning Susan and Caleb could never refile the same claims. More significantly, she referred the case to the district attorney's office for potential criminal prosecution, noting that the evidence strongly suggested that the plaintiffs had committed multiple felonies in pursuit of their fraudulent claims. Susan and Caleb's reaction to the criminal referral was visible shock. Throughout the civil proceedings, they had seemed confident that the worst-case scenario would be losing the lawsuit. The possibility of facing criminal charges for document forgery and attempted fraud clearly hadn't occurred to them. Based on the judge's ruling and the strength of the evidence, my lawyer recommended that we file a counter-lawsuit against Susan and Caleb for damages, legal fees, and emotional distress. Months after the ruling, we filed suit seeking compensation for the $38,000 in legal fees I had incurred defending against their frivolous lawsuit, plus additional damages for the emotional distress of having to fight Helen's family while still grieving her loss. Meanwhile, the district attorney's office filed criminal charges against both Susan and Caleb. The charges included document forgery, attempted fraud, and theft by deception, all felonies that carried potential prison sentences. Faced with overwhelming evidence and the prospect of serious jail time, Susan and Caleb's new attorney began plea negotiations almost immediately. The criminal charges changed everything about Susan and Caleb's attitude toward the situation. Suddenly, the same people who had been aggressively pursuing a $10 million lawsuit were desperately trying to reach out to me to apologize and settle the case. Susan called my house multiple times, leaving voicemails claiming that the whole thing had been a misunderstanding and that they just wanted to put the situation behind them. The phone calls were revealing in their desperation. Susan claimed that they had been given bad legal advice and that they never intended to commit fraud. She offered to pay my legal fees if I would ask the district attorney to drop the criminal charges. Caleb sent a letter through his attorney claiming that he had been misled by Susan and that his involvement had been minimal. None of these appeals changed the fundamental facts of the case. Susan and Caleb had forged documents, made false representations to businesses, and attempted to steal assets that legally belonged to me. Their belated apologies didn't undo the months of legal battles, the emotional distress, or the dishonor they had brought to Helen's memory. 3 months later, we reached a settlement on the civil case. Susan and Caleb agreed to pay all my legal costs, plus additional damages for emotional distress. The total settlement was $45,000, enough to cover my expenses and compensate me for the months of unnecessary legal battles. The resolution of this case provided a sense of closure, but it also confirmed everything Helen had told me about her family over the years. Susan and Caleb had shown no interest in Helen while she was alive, rarely calling or visiting, and never offering support during her illness. But the moment she died, they saw dollar signs and were willing to forge documents and commit fraud in pursuit of money they had no legal right to claim. This experience taught me several important lessons about the intersection of grief, family dynamics, and legal rights. When someone dies, especially someone with assets, it can bring out the worst in people who feel entitled to something they have no legal right to claim. The combination of grief and money can lead to situations that would be unimaginable under normal circumstances. I also learned the importance of proper documentation and having competent legal representation. If I hadn't kept meticulous records of our joint assets and hadn't hired my lawyer to handle both the original estate proceedings and the subsequent lawsuit, this situation could have been much more complicated and expensive. My lawyer's thoroughness in discovering the document forgery transformed what could have been a prolonged civil dispute into a clear-cut case of criminal fraud. For anyone facing a similar situation, my advice is to understand your legal rights under the law and to maintain clear documentation of jointly owned assets. If you're married, the laws in most states strongly favor the surviving spouse, but you need to be able to prove your legal relationship and the ownership status of your assets. Don't assume that family members will respect legal boundaries, especially when significant amounts of money are involved. Most importantly, don't be afraid to fight for what's legally yours, even when you're grieving. Susan and Caleb were counting on my grief and desire to avoid conflict to pressure me into a settlement. They assumed I wouldn't have the energy or resources to fight a prolonged legal battle while dealing with the loss of my wife. They were wrong, and their miscalculation cost them dearly. The legal system, for all its flaws, worked exactly as it should have in this case. Clear laws, thorough documentation, and competent legal representation prevailed over forgery, fraud, and frivolous litigation. Justice was served, Helen's memory was protected, and Susan and Caleb learned that there are serious consequences for attempting to profit from someone else's death through illegal means. Today, several months after this legal battle concluded, I can look back on the experience with a mixture of satisfaction and sadness. Satisfaction that justice was served and that Helen's wishes were ultimately respected. Sadness that her family chose to dishonor her memory in pursuit of money they had no right to claim. But most of all, I'm grateful that Helen never had to see how low her family was willing to stoop. She deserved better than Susan and Caleb. Thank you for watching.